Okay, so I'm talking about Edith, Green-Wendell, Wyatt. Well, I'm really speaking on this particular building because the CTBUH gave this building Best Tall Building in the Americas in 2014, which was an enormous award for GSA and the program in general. But basically, I'm speaking to a program. This building, that there's nothing hugely wrong with this, but as I go through and what we have for energy mandates, the way the existing building was, as a lot of buildings are, all four sides exactly the same. To meet our energy targets was going to, on this particular building, was going to require a major intervention, and so I'm going to kind of walk through that. At GSA, we have 1,500 owned buildings. It says 34% of them built between 1950 and 1979. Where that, and that's just that huge post-war building boom. And for us, where that's a big lift right now is that the buildings older than that have been fully modernized or replaced, and the buildings younger than that aren't in need of modernization. So the bulk of our work right now, doing less new construction, and we're doing, we do about $1.5 billion in construction a year, and probably about $1 billion of that is going towards modernization of this era building. There's one in every city. Just when I think I've been to every city, I'll have to go to Pierre, South Dakota or somewhere, and there's another one of these buildings there waiting to be renovated. A lot have been, but I think right now we've got about 350 buildings yet to be modernized. So it's a big lift for the program. Some terrific buildings. We go through in about 2000. We had a symposium at Yale looking at buildings of the Great Society or the modern era buildings, and we go through a process where we determine if they're preserve worthy. This is the Chicago Federal Center by Mies van der Rohe, definitely one of the preserve worthy buildings, but Edith, Green-Wendell, Wyatt, there's 30 buildings just like it in the inventory. There wasn't anything particularly special about that building, so it would be a major intervention, or we choose to do something different and kind of make a conscious decision on that project by project, whether you're going to take more of a preservation perspective or approach it a little differently. Executive order, this is sort of drives a lot of what we do. You see the second one, reduce metered energy use by 30% by 2015. Huge goal where actually right now I think we're going to be about 0.5% short, so that by the end of this year, over the past since January 2007, we've reduced the energy use by about 29.5% is where we think we're going to end up. But if you look down there at the bottom, by 2030 the goal is that we 100% reduction in fossil fuel requirements. I will be retired by the time that happens, but no one at GSA quite knows how we're going to do that, but everyone's thinking about it with every project you do. You know, how are we going to get to that goal by 2030? Oh, also we started LEED registered was a requirement since 1999, and LEED Gold has been a requirement on GSA projects since 2009. This is just the alteration needs in the existing inventory. So there's about $4.7 billion worth of work yet to be done in the inventory. And if we're doing about even $1 billion a year, that alteration needs grows every year. So even if we're knocking off $1 billion a year of it, it's going to take us a while to get the work done. I like this. It sort of goes with what Michael said. This is a campaign the National Trust for Historic Preservation did a few years ago. And in that was the thing of building a 50,000 square foot building requires the same amount of energy it takes to drive a car 20,000 miles a year for 730 years. You do the math on Edith, Green-Wendell, Wyatt, 500,000 square foot building. That's the same as 10 cars, the amount of energy it would take to drive 10 cars for 730 years. It's significant. And if you look at the overall inventory of 60,000 gross square feet, that's 1,200 cars, 20,000 miles a year for 730 years. They're pretty big numbers. So here's the building after we stripped off the existing exterior. In this building, we were also fortunate enough that the lease market in Portland was such that we could vacate the building and totally renovate it. Most buildings we're doing, 4 or 5 floors at a time. Here in New York, I'm always in Washington. Here in New York, the federal building at 26 Federal Plaza, we're moving about 6 floors of tenants into the World Trade Center, which will be the swing space to start the renovation of that building. That building was finished in 1971 and will start a major modernization next year. Here's the building after it's been stripped off. I think interesting to point out, let's see if I can do that with a pointer. Well, anyway, from the profile of the existing building, taking the way the windows were stepped in, taking everything out to the exterior of the building, we gained about 25,000 square feet in this building overall, which is about the same size as adding additional floor. Where that's important to GSA is, you may not realize, but the way we operate is we charge federal tenants rent. That rent comes into the federal buildings fund, and then the energy, the operational expenses used to operate the buildings. What's left over in the federal buildings fund, which is about $1.5 billion a year, that's the money that's used. We get authorized and authorized to spend that money out of federal buildings fund. So it's sort of a it self-governs agencies to limit the amount of space they rent, number one, and it provides the capital to keep the program going. Also, a big part of what we're doing right now is that most agencies, we're going through an initiative to reduce the square footage. I think it's not just GSA, but everyone's looking to reduce the utilization rate. So we're trying to get all federal tenants in space under 150 square feet per person. Next point I was going to make is location matters. All of these buildings that you see across the country, they're in the best sites already. So we've got a 500,000 square foot site that's in the best part of Portland, access to public transit, et cetera, and this utilizes that. If we're choosing a new site, it's not going to be in the middle of the downtown core, it's going to be on the outside. Executive order, we need to consider first being in the downtown core, and so trying to reuse these buildings makes a lot of sense from that perspective as well. Just site comparison, the existing site has 100 walk score, transit score of 95, and just comparing that to a business center where we have lease space in Portland, Oregon. Same thing, went through walk score and sort of the advantages, giving you a preview of what the building looks like after the renovation. Talk a little bit about the Design Excellence Program. We've been doing this since 2004, so last year was, since 1994, I'm sorry, last year was the 20th anniversary of the Design Excellence Program. It's a program where when we hire firms, we've sort of reinvented 20 years ago how you go about getting work for GSA. Number one, focus on the lead designers so that stage one submissions are really simple. It's just like a 1/4 inch thick, that we look at the lead designers' portfolio of work and then select phase two, ask for the entire submission, and then peer review, that we have a list of, actually it's about 500 architects, engineers, artists, acousticians, et cetera. So we bring in leaders in the industry to review a project. Every design project usually has 2 peer reviews, sometimes 3, before we get to a concept approval on a project. This particular project, as most project, has small business goals that you've got to meet, going through those. Anyway, this is the registry of builders and designers on a project. Every GSA project, all the construction workers, everyone who works on a project, we put a registry of designers and builders in the lobby to the building. Small business goals. Buying local is important. Actually, in this project, show this slide, they did the tenant fit out by floor so that small businesses could bond the build out of a single floor, and they were successful on a single floor, moved to another floor to get small business participation up. It's hard to bond a full, $60 million project. This says, I changed this earlier because there's actually 4 high-rise projects that have achieved LEED Platinum, but anyway, I just got that information this morning and updated it. So there's 4 projects in the U.S. to achieve LEED Platinum, which is building achieved. And going back, here's the original concept, and I showed you the exterior profile and how that profile went out to the perimeter. Jim Cutler was the architect from Bainbridge Island. Sarah Architects from Portland were the executive architects. And what this is showing is the original concept. The original concept on this building was that the west facade was going to have vegetation going up the full height of the building so that in the summer it would shade the building. In the winter, the vines, the leaves would drop off the vines and get natural daylight and sun into the building. We went through peer review, had a concept approval, and that actually was the way the building was designed and approved, and everyone was excited about it. Then got to the engineering part, and it wasn't going to work out so well. It didn't look like the vines were going to grow that high. I think now that if we were doing this project in 2015, I think that we could do this. But in 2009, it was a leap of faith that we just couldn't take, that when the building would have been occupied, there were studies to show that the solar gain on the west side of the building was going to be incredible, and so that for the first 5 to 10 years of the building's reinvention, the energy usage would have been really not so good. So looked at alternatives to the vegetated side. Let me go through the rest of the showing you what the vegetated side, which is the west side, and also the design was, the north, south, east, west, all 4 sides were dealt with accordingly. So this is what we ended up with. This is sort of the concept, is that growing vegetation from the ground level so that at the pedestrian level you have that experience, but going up the full height of the building, there are actually, that you see over here, there are extruded aluminum reeds that create the shading, sort of assimilating, and these were actually modeled, computer modeled to get the optimum shading in the summer and light in the winter. And that's the final look of the building from the park across the street. If you haven't been to Portland, this is actually directly across Michael Graves' Portlandia is right across the park from this building. Shows you the west side and a little bit of the south side. And the vines growing up from the ground only. And they only go so far. There were ways, and I think there are ways that could have been dealt with a little differently. And also the photovoltaic array on the roof. The photovoltaic array on the roof collects rainwater. It's full gray water flushing of the toilets, the firing range in the building. What was the firing range for law enforcement is now the cistern in the building, so there's a 275,000 gallon tank. I was there about a year ago and the water was running low where they were getting the warning light, and oddly enough, you wouldn't think Portland has a fair amount of drought, but anyway, the gray water, the toilets flush, all the landscaping is watered by water from the roof. This shows you the north side of the building, north and the west side, and at the ground level. And this is the entrance into the building. Actually, the entrance and exit on this building have been separated. When you go into a federal building, you go in, go through magnetometer, go through security, and then as you exit a different path, so it keeps the circulation in the building correct. This is the entrance lobby. On the left side, you see the art and architecture. We spend 0.5% on art as a piece. Tim Babington is the artist. Louie Louie is the name of the piece. It actually has to do with the song Louie Louie, had some reference to the FBI in the 60s, and that's where the artist got his inspiration. The interiors in the lobby. And then here on the left, I think this is pretty cool. You see actually the slab was cut to allow natural daylight down into the lower level of the building. There's a conference center in the lower level. As we've increased the density of our buildings, the building I'm in Washington, we've increased the occupancy of the building, about doubled it. So conference space becomes a real premium. In this building, they cut the slab to allow, you can see down into the lower level, there's a conference center in the lower level, sort of what was previously just storage space became naturally lit and reutilized. And then this is a view looking across the plaza from looking west through the aluminum reeds that replaced the this wood. In the original concept would have been the vegetated side, and then from the ground level. From the entry looking up. And then that's back to sort of what we have left. Actually, a couple of those buildings have been renovated, but this is probably the rest of my career at GSA. This will be the work that we're tackling.